In the autumn of 1983, in a storage room of the New York Public Library's photography collection, an archivist cataloging daguerreotypes from the 1850s noticed something that did not align with the building records she had been cross-referencing. The afternoon was quiet, the overhead fluorescent lights humming faintly as she worked through box after box of early photographic plates. She had been assigned to document street scenes of Lower Manhattan, matching each image to its approximate location using period maps and architectural surveys. The photograph she held showed a building on what appeared to be Pearl Street, circa 1852. The structure was elegant, 3 stories of brick with ornate cornices and tall windows. But the ground floor was not at ground level. It was buried. The first-story windows sat half-submerged beneath the street surface, their upper panes level with the sidewalk. Basement stairs descended not down from the street, but up, emerging from below the pavement to reach what should have been the ground floor. She compared the image to a survey map dated 1855. The map showed the building at street level, its entrance flush with the sidewalk. No excavation, no elevation change. The dates were 3 years apart. The photograph showed a building half buried. The map showed the same building at grade. She made a notation in her catalog. Apparent discrepancy in ground level requires clarification. No clarification was ever provided. She set the daguerreotype aside and continued through the collection. More street scenes, more buildings, and more of the same pattern. Structures with their ground floors below street level, windows emerging from what appeared to be sediment or fill, doors accessed by stairs that descended into the earth rather than entering at grade. In some images, the burial was so extensive that what were clearly second-story windows sat at street level, while the floors below vanished into the ground. The archivist pulled building records for several addresses visible in the photographs. The records described these structures as built at grade, their foundations at the level of the street as it existed when they were constructed. They made no mention of burial, excavation, or the addition of fill that would explain why, in photographs taken within a decade of their construction, they appeared half-submerged. She compiled her observations into a memo submitted to the library's Historical Collections Department, suggesting that someone with expertise in urban development and civil engineering review the images. The memo was filed. The photographs were cataloged and stored. The discrepancy remained unexplained. On the 7th of March, 1868, in San Francisco, a photographer named Edward Muybridge set up his camera on a hillside overlooking the city's downtown. The day was clear, the air sharp with the cold that follows winter storms. Muybridge, known for his technical precision, was documenting the city's reconstruction following years of rapid growth. The exposure took several minutes, long enough for the city to appear frozen, its streets empty of moving figures, its buildings rendered in stark detail. When Muybridge developed the plate, the image revealed something he had not consciously noted while composing the shot. The buildings along Montgomery Street, the city's commercial core, sat at varying levels relative to the street. Some structures had their entrances at grade, others appeared sunken, their ground floors partially below the road surface. In several cases, buildings on the same block sat at different elevations, as if the street had risen around some while leaving others behind. Muybridge made prints of the image and sold them as part of his city series, commercial photographs documenting San Francisco's urban landscape. The prints circulated widely. No contemporary account remarked on the varying elevations. It was simply how the city looked. The phenomenon was not unique to American cities. In London, photographs from the 1860s show similar patterns along the Thames embankment and in districts undergoing modernization. Buildings that had stood for decades, their entrances at street level, now appeared partially buried as streets were raised and regraded. Official records attributed this to deliberate civic improvements, the installation of sewer systems requiring streets to be lifted, the filling of low-lying areas to improve drainage, the leveling of steep grades to facilitate transport. These explanations were documented in municipal engineering reports, published in newspapers, and recorded in city planning archives. They were not secrets. They were public works projects, planned and executed with the understanding that the city's surface would be altered and that older structures might be left partially below the new grade. This was understood as progress, the transformation of chaotic, unplanned growth into ordered, functional urban space. But the extent of the burial and the speed with which it occurred raises questions that the official explanations do not fully address. In Chicago, photographs taken before and after the Great Fire of 1871 show a dramatic change in street levels. Pre-fire images depict buildings with ground floor entrances at grade. Post-fire images, taken as the city rebuilt, show new structures elevated on what appear to be artificial platforms, while surviving older buildings sit sunken relative to the new street level. The official account describes this as intentional. Chicago's streets were raised during Reconstruction to improve drainage in a city built on swampland. The project, led by engineer Ellis S. Chesbrough, lifted streets by as much as 10 feet using fill material brought in from outside the city. Buildings that were not raised along with the streets were left below grade. Some property owners chose to raise their structures, jacking them up on screw jacks and inserting new foundations beneath them. Others chose not to, leaving their buildings in place as the streets rose around them. The engineering achievement was substantial and well documented. Yet photographs from this period show not just buildings left behind by intentional street raising, but structures that appear to have been submerged in material that resembles sediment rather than engineered fill. In images of streets under construction, the material visible in cross-section looks less like the clay and gravel described in engineering reports and more like layered deposits consistent with natural accumulation. Stratified, compacted, and containing debris that suggests longer timescales than the months attributed to the street raising project. A geological survey conducted in 1875 by the U.S. Geological Survey examined soil profiles in Chicago and noted that beneath the engineered fill, layers of sediment existed that were not accounted for in construction records. The survey report described these layers as of uncertain origin, possibly fluvial or lacustrine in nature, predating urban development. The report did not speculate on how such layers could have accumulated over structures built only decades earlier. In 1902, a civil engineer in Seattle named Reginald H. Thompson oversaw a massive regrading project that reshaped the city's topography. Hills were sluiced away using high-pressure water cannons, and the resulting slurry was used to fill ravines and raise low-lying areas. Photographs from this period show neighborhoods in transition, some streets at their original elevation, others raised by 20 feet or more, creating a patchwork cityscape where buildings on adjacent blocks existed at dramatically different levels. The project was documented extensively, with engineers keeping detailed records of the volumes of earth moved, the methods used, and the costs incurred. These records are preserved in the Seattle Municipal Archives. They describe a planned transformation executed over years, with property owners notified and compensated for changes to their land. The photographs, however, show something additional. In images of areas not officially included in the regrading project, neighborhoods outside the designated zones, buildings appear partially buried in material that does not match the slurry used in the document regrading. The material is finer, more uniform, and in some cases contains organic matter that should not be present in fill derived from hill sluicing operations. A study conducted in 1978 by a geologist at the University of Washington examined soil samples from beneath buildings in Seattle's Pioneer Square district, structures dating to the 1880s. The samples, taken from excavations during renovation work, revealed layers of sediment beneath the building's original foundations. The layers were dated using relative stratigraphy and compared to known depositional environments. The geologist's report, published in a regional geological journal, proposed that the sediment represented historic flood deposits from a period when the area was more susceptible to inundation from Puget Sound. The report suggested that these deposits accumulated before urban development and that early builders had constructed on top of them without fully excavating to bedrock. This explanation accounted for some of the observed burial, but not all. It did not explain why buildings photographed at grade level in the 1880s appeared partially buried in photographs from the 1890s, a span too short for natural sedimentation to account for several feet of accumulation. The phenomenon extended beyond American cities. In European urban centers, particularly those with extensive photographic documentation from the mid-19th century, similar patterns appear. In Paris, images from the 1850s and 1860s, taken during Baron Haussmann's renovation of the city, show buildings along the Seine and in older districts with their ground floors below the newly raised street levels. Haussmann's renovations involved widening boulevards, installing sewers, and modernizing infrastructure, all of which required adjusting street grades. The work was planned meticulously with engineering drawings and contracts specifying the extent of changes. Yet, photographs from districts not included in Haussmann's projects show buildings partially sunken into the ground, their lower windows obscured by what appears to be accumulated earth. Official records for these districts do not mention street raising or the addition of fill. The buildings simply appear buried, and the burial goes unremarked in contemporary accounts. In Edinburgh, the construction of the new town in the late 18th and early 19th centuries involved extensive grading and the creation of new streets at elevations different from the old town. Bridges connected the two areas, spanning the valleys between them. Photographs from the 1860s show the old town's buildings partially submerged relative to the new town's street level. This is understood as the result of deliberate planning. The new town was built on higher ground, and the old town was left at its original elevation. But within the old town itself, photographs show buildings at varying levels, some sunken relative to their neighbors, despite having been built on the same ground at the same time. A study of Edinburgh's urban development, published in 1995 by an architectural historian, noted these discrepancies and attributed them to differential settling and the accumulation of street refuse over centuries. The study did not explain why such accumulation would affect some buildings and not others on the same street, or how centuries of refuse could accumulate in the span of decades documented by the photographs. The official explanations, intentional street raising, sewer installation, differential settling, refuse accumulation, are not necessarily wrong. They describe processes that occurred and are well documented in civic records, but they do not fully account for the visual evidence in the photographs. The images show burial patterns that are more extensive, more uniform, and more rapid than the documented projects would produce. They show material that does not always match the engineered fill described in reports, and they show structures submerged in sediment in locations where no official project explains the change in grade. On the 12th of November, 1889, in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, a photographer documenting the aftermath of the catastrophic flood that had devastated the town 5 months earlier found buildings partially buried under layers of debris and sediment. The flood, caused by the failure of the South Fork Dam, had swept through the valley with such force that it rearranged the landscape, depositing mud, gravel, and wreckage across the town. The photographer's images show structures half-submerged, their lower floors filled with solidified mud, their windows caked with dried silt. This was understood as the direct result of the flood, a singular catastrophic event that explained the burial unambiguously. Yet, in subsequent decades, as Johnstown rebuilt, photographs showed that the town's new structures were built at elevations higher than the pre-flood grade, and that surviving older buildings remained partially buried even after the flood debris had been cleared. The decision to raise the new grade was attributed to flood mitigation, ensuring that future inundations would not reach the same levels. But the extent of the elevation change exceeded what would be necessary for flood control alone, and the older buildings were left sunken in a manner similar to structures in cities that had not experienced catastrophic floods. By the early 20th century, the pattern of partially buried buildings in 19th century photographs had become common enough that it attracted attention from architectural historians documenting the evolution of urban form. A 1923 study by the American Institute of Architects examined photographs of major U.S. cities from the 1850s through the 1890s, noting the prevalence of ground-level changes and offering the explanation that rapid urban growth necessitated frequent adjustments to street grades as infrastructure was installed and improved. The study cited specific projects: Chicago's street raising, Seattle's regrading, New York's sewer installation, as examples of how cities adapted their physical form to modern needs. The study treated the phenomenon as a well-understood aspect of urban development, nothing mysterious or requiring further investigation. The photographs were evidence of progress, of cities modernizing and improving themselves. Yet individual images, examined closely, reveal details that complicate this narrative. In a photograph of Boston's Back Bay district from 1862, buildings along Beacon Street show varying levels of burial. Some structures have their ground floors at street level. Others, identical in design and built at the same time, sit with their first floors several feet below grade. The official history of Back Bay describes it as a filled tidal flat, with construction occurring on land reclaimed from the Charles River Basin. The filling project, conducted between 1857 and 1882, brought in gravel by rail from Needham, creating new land on which the neighborhood was built. Structures built on this fill should all sit at the same elevation, determined by the level of the fill as it was placed. The photographs show otherwise. The discrepancies suggest that either the fill was placed unevenly, unlikely given the scale and oversight of the project, or that some structures settled differentially, sinking into the fill at rates that varied from building to building. Differential settling is possible, but the extent and pattern of settling visible in the photographs exceed what would be expected from typical foundation behavior on engineered fill. In 1957, an urban planner in Portland, Oregon, reviewing historical photographs as part of a downtown redevelopment study, noted that images from the 1880s showed buildings with sunken ground floors clustered in specific areas of the city. The planner, assuming this was the result of localized street raising projects, requested records from the city engineer's office detailing when and where such projects had occurred. The records provided information on several documented street improvements between 1880 and 1900, but none in the areas where the photographs showed the most extensive burial. The planner noted this discrepancy in his report, suggesting that additional projects might have occurred without being formally recorded. The report was filed with the city's planning department. No follow-up investigation was conducted. The redevelopment proceeded, and the older structures, most of which were demolished during the project, were not examined for evidence of the sediment that had once surrounded them. The question of where the material came from, the sediment, fill, or earth that buried these structures, is addressed in official records through references to specific sources. Chicago's fill came from the outskirts of the city and from areas being excavated for other construction. Seattle's came from the hills being regraded. Paris's came from quarries and excavation sites within and around the city. These sources are documented, and the volumes of material moved are recorded, but the quantities do not always match the visual evidence. The amount of fill required to bury ground floors across entire districts in multiple cities, simultaneously, over the span of a few decades, exceeds the documented supply in many cases. Engineering reports describe moving thousands of cubic yards of material, but photographs suggest the accumulation was larger, more widespread, and occurred in areas where no fill projects were recorded. Geological explanations focus on natural processes, sediment deposition from flooding, windblown dust accumulation, organic matter buildup from vegetation and refuse. These processes occur, and over long timescales, they can produce significant changes in ground level, but the timescales required for such accumulation are measured in centuries or millennia, not the decades between a building's construction and the photographs showing it buried. Accelerated sedimentation can occur in specific environments: river deltas, floodplains, coastal areas subject to storm surge, but most of the cities showing burial patterns in 19th century photographs are not located in environments where rapid natural sedimentation would be expected. They are on stable terrains, away from active floodplains, on bedrock or glacial, till that does not readily produce sediment in the volumes needed to bury multi-story structures. On the 18th of April, 1906, the San Francisco earthquake and subsequent fires destroyed much of the city. In the rebuilding that followed, streets were regraded, infrastructure modernized, and entire neighborhoods reconstructed. Photographs from the Reconstruction period show workers excavating foundations for new buildings, cutting through layers of debris, ash, and sediment. In some images, the excavations reveal older foundations and walls buried beneath the pre-earthquake street level. These older structures, built in the 1850s and 1860s, had been at grade when constructed, but were found several feet below the surface after the earthquake. The official explanation attributes this to the accumulation of refuse, the raising of streets during minor improvement projects, and the settling of loose fill in areas reclaimed from the bay. Yet the older structures were not in reclaimed areas. They were on solid ground, on hillsides and ridges where settling should not have occurred. The layers above them were not refuse but sediment, compacted and stratified in ways consistent with deposition over time, not dumping. The phenomenon's persistence into the early 20th century, despite increasing documentation and record-keeping, suggests that whatever caused it was either not fully understood by contemporaries or was understood but not deemed worthy of special note. Civic engineers and urban planners operated within a framework where adjusting street levels was a routine part of development. The fact that older buildings ended up below grade was seen as an inevitable consequence of progress, not a mystery requiring explanation. Property owners adapted by converting buried ground floors into basements, installing new entrances at the elevated street level, or abandoning lower floors altogether. Life continued. The city functioned. The burial was accommodated. In modern urban archaeology, the phenomenon of buried structures is well known. Excavations for new construction regularly uncover foundations, walls, and street surfaces from earlier periods, buried beneath layers of subsequent development. This is understood as the natural result of continuous occupation. Cities build on top of themselves, each generation adding a layer to the archaeological record. In Rome, excavations reveal multiple strata of urban development, with ancient structures buried beneath medieval streets, which are themselves beneath modern pavement. In London, the Roman city lies meters below the present surface, accessible only through excavation. This layering occurs over centuries and millennia, the result of gradual accumulation, rebuilding after disasters, and the deposition of material as cities grow and change. But the burial visible in 19th century photographs occurred within decades, not centuries. It represents a rapid change in ground level that, while accommodated and explained through references to civic projects and natural processes, remains striking in its extent and uniformity. The photographs themselves are matter of fact, documentary in nature. They were not taken to highlight the burial, but to record the city as it appeared. The fact that buildings were half buried was simply part of the urban landscape, unremarkable enough to go without comment in the captions and descriptions that accompanied the images when they were published in city directories, promotional materials, and photographic surveys. In 2007, a graduate student in urban history at a university in Toronto conducted a survey of 19th century photographs from multiple North American cities, compiling a database of images showing buried structures. The survey included images from New York, Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, Montreal, and Toronto itself. The student categorized the images by date, location, and the extent of burial visible, then cross-referenced them with municipal records documenting street-raising projects, sewer installations, and other infrastructure work. The analysis revealed that while many instances of burial correlated with documented projects, a significant minority did not. Approximately 30% of the images showing buried structures were from locations and time periods where no official project explained the change in grade. The student presented these findings in a thesis, proposing that undocumented localized projects, differential settling, and natural sedimentation contributed to the unexplained burial. The thesis was accepted, but the findings were not pursued further. The database was archived with the university's digital collections, accessible but rarely consulted. Today, cities continue to evolve, and ground levels continue to change. Modern construction involves excavation and backfill, the installation of underground infrastructure, and the adjustment of grades to accommodate new development. In areas undergoing redevelopment, older buildings are sometimes demolished, revealing foundations that sit well below the current street level. These discoveries are routine, expected by archaeologists and engineers who understand that cities are layered, their surfaces rising over time as material accumulates and new construction adds to the built environment. The process is ongoing, visible in any city where construction crews dig into the ground and expose the strata of previous occupation. The photographs from the 1800s, showing cities half buried in what appears to be sediment, document a moment in this ongoing process. They capture a transition, a period when cities were modernizing rapidly, when infrastructure projects were transforming urban landscapes, and when the ground level was in flux. The images are evidence of change, of adaptation, of the physical reality of living in cities during an era of unprecedented growth and development. They are also evidence of something less easily explained, a pattern of burial that, while accommodated and addressed through various official and natural processes, remains more extensive, more rapid, and more widespread than those processes alone would seem to produce. If history is written by those who build the cities and maintain their records, then the story of buried buildings is a story of progress, of improvement, of the necessary sacrifices made to create modern urban infrastructure. The photographs exist as documentation, their evidence preserved in archives and collections, accessible to anyone who seeks them. What they show is visible, measurable, and real. Why they show it? Why so many structures from the mid-19th century appear half-buried in images taken only decades after their construction is a question answered partially by engineering reports and civic projects, but not entirely. The sediment remains in the photographs and beneath the streets, a layer of history that was lived through, adapted to, and ultimately built over, leaving behind images that ask questions which the official record addresses but does not fully resolve.